Julie Rendleman, Bill Thompson, the prosecutor gets the last word that says an October 2nd trial date would be fine for him. But we know that the prosecution has 60 days to decide whether there's going to be a death penalty, and we also know that mitigation on behalf of the defendant has already begun because we're trial attorneys. But because he didn't enter a plea, that gives him a lot of options, doesn't it, in the future, Julie?
Sure. I mean, he would have had those options anyway, but one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is there any way he might plead guilty if the prosecution takes the death penalty off the table? We don't know for sure that they're going to do it, but if we're assuming that they're headed in that direction, that might be one way that we see a plea without a trial happening. And again, this would be something that the defense would be spending quite a lot of time, not only with the prosecution, but with their own client, going through every piece of evidence they have, because we may not see it as quote unquote a strong case. People talk about circumstantial evidence, and some people think that's not strong, but quite frankly, circumstantial evidence can be, as we all know, much stronger than direct evidence. And this defense may be explaining to him what the possibilities could be, and maybe a plea could be on the table.
Sure, and as we discussed earlier with you, Ben Chu, that sometimes not pleading at this point, standing silent on your rights may be a beneficial thing when the defense tries to negotiate either with a judge in the future or with the jury who's going to hear mitigation. But let's talk about the issue of motive. The prosecution has indicted Mr. Kohberger for willfully intentional premeditation, going in and killing, slaughtering, I would say, these four kids, these four young people whose lives were ahead of them. And there's been speculation about evidence. Now, we know we do have a knife sheath that was left in the bed in the house, and that we do know before the gag order was put on that it did have DNA. Do we know whether or not anything happened to that DNA? Do we know whether it was tested, whether it was consumed, whether it came back to being Bryan Kohberger? Tell us. Ben.
Oh, yeah, sorry, Linda. Yeah, I think that's being analyzed right now. And obviously that is something the defense is going to challenge, and challenge hard, the DNA evidence.
Yeah, because that's really the big deal. As we know, that's the one thing that doesn't depend upon, people's eyewitness testimony, which sometimes could be wrong. Julie Rendleman, there's also been speculation about the motive here. Some say, well, maybe he got dissed by one of the victims here, but the diss doesn't mean that he was dissed because he wanted to date somebody and she didn't want to. It could also be a diss to him because of who he is. It could be anything, couldn't it, Julie Rendleman?
Right. And remember, motive, they're not required to prove motive, but motive is certainly helpful for a jury to understand why it would be that an individual who hadn't committed such a heinous crime before entered into a home and decided to take the lives of these young women and man. But I do think that the prosecution is going to have a theory that they're going to bring along with them throughout this case. In terms of his motive, whether it be stalking or obsession or whatever it is in regards to at least one of the women that live there. And I think that is going to be something that you are definitely going to hear about throughout the trial.
And Ben, going back to your original point, when they had not found Bryan Kohberger yet, and I was staying at a house down at the Jersey Shore, and it had a backyard that people could enter and come up with the windows and all. I was like, whoa, let me stay up all night, because his look is scary. And when he was in that courtroom today, nothing has changed about that look. He seems that he is going to do what he's going to do. He's going to be strong at it. And I can only imagine, if he is the killer, the poor victims in that house. So with that being said, it's wise to keep him out of the courtroom as much as you can if you're a defense attorney, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. He has a very creepy affect. He's very confident. He's not scared. He doesn't look like, he doesn't have the look, it sounds silly, but he doesn't have the look of somebody who has been falsely accused, because that would be the look of terror and pleading and wanting to make your innocence known. There's nothing about his affect that suggests that.
Yeah, terror and pleading is what I now associate with the victims in this case. So, Julie Rendleman, can the defense, we know that there's an issue that when he was arrested, he said, has anyone else been arrested? Number one, this is the A part for you, Julie. who do you think that was about? Number two, what is the best evidence the prosecution has right now? And remember, we are under a gag order. And number three, if they got to him through genetic genealogy and they're not giving that over to the defense, can the defense poke holes in the case? So A, B, and C, Julie, I know you can do it.
I can't remember A. So, I'm going to have to go, let's start last.
Okay.
I'll be honest, if I'm the prosecution, I'm handing over everything. I'm not hiding anything. I don't want any chance on earth that if I get a guilty verdict at the end of the day, that anyone's going to be able to have an appellate issue that I didn't turn over anything and everything. So whether it be DNA, genealogy, trees, I don't care what it is, I'm turning it over because this is not the case to hold back anything. In terms of what is the best evidence, I think the sheath is the thing that stands out to everyone. But I think what we're ultimately going to believe and what the prosecution is going to argue is put the sheath to the side. Look at all the different pieces of evidence. Look at the cellular data that I think is going to be overwhelming in this case in terms of where that car was and when it was. I think those pieces are going to be even more dominant in this trial than any DNA.
So, Ben, I'll go to the A question that Julie didn't answer, but
I forgot that one.
But there was so much there. When he was arrested, allegedly, Bryan Kohberger said, has anyone else been arrested? Do you think that there's somebody else that could be arrested that could be complicit in such a way? I mean, we haven't, I know there's a gag order, but we haven't heard much from the family, have we? His family.
No, that's a fascinating piece of the puzzle. Of course, his asking is also, arguably incriminating as well. There doesn't seem to be any evidence yet of the complicity of somebody else, but it would be interesting to see how it plays out.
Okay, so I have a really interesting question, Julie Rendelman, as a former prosecutor. And it was a question for our question and answers that one of our viewers sent in, and we didn't get a chance to answer it. Let's assume that Bryan Kohberger went into that house and targeted one or two victims. Maybe he targeted one, and one of the women upstairs, and she happened to be with another woman, and he kills both. And then he finds other people in the house, really, who are witnesses, or that he unexpectedly encounters. Do you think that he could be found guilty, for instance, maybe of one intentional homicide, but 3 manslaughter counts? Could there be a difference in degree that the defense will be concentrating on?
That's a great question. I don't see manslaughter. I believe, and again, I don't know the specifics, but it might not be premeditated for all of them, but I believe there's no question it's going to be murder. I think it's going to be hard pressed for the jury to decipher which. Did he go in just for one person? Did he go in for multiple individuals? But I can't fathom a scenario in which they find him guilty of murder one in regards to one of the victims and then simply come back with manslaughter in regards to the other 3.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you, but I do think he had at least one of the victims in his sights for being dissed, and I'm not sure it's for being dissed in the manner we think it is, that, she rejected him for dating. But we'll find that out, and that's why there's a gag order, because we're all speculating right now. In any event, we're going to take a quick break, give my 2 guests a break from the constant badgering I have of them, the questions and answering, but this most interesting case, and a case that takes a step towards justice as the families perceive it, the case of Bryan Kohberger.